the ACLU. I work as a technologist within the Speech Privacy and Technology project there. Should I?
You're good.
Okay. So I'm interested in the different ways that our infrastructure has this effect on civil rights and civil liberties. And so the discussion that I wanted to have here was to try to point out the different ways that the private DNS resolver themselves has a sort of trust relationship with the user, and to make sure that we have a clear understanding of what that means, so that as we encourage people to adopt these tools, and as we move in that direction, we're aware of what some of the trade-offs are, and we can sort of think about what are the best policies for people operating resolvers and for people who are selecting a resolver to use. I was going to scroll through the slides here if I can do that. Are we good? Right. So in particular, as the previous talk pointed out, there's these questions about what happens above the recursive. But with most of the DNS privacy work that's been done thus far, we've been talking stub to recursive, trying to provide technical protections there. In all of the implementations that I've seen, it requires the user to explicitly configure a resolver that they're going to use, right? So they have this, and I've got this highlighted here, this sort of red link is the encrypted channel between the user and their resolver that goes through this cloud that otherwise would be able to snoop on all of the DNS traffic. And so my question that I want to sort of encourage us to think about as a community is, what is that relationship that's happening there between the user, the operator of the stub, and the resolver? Like what does that trust relationship look like? And I'll go into more technical detail there. Okay. So why now, right? So why is this a question about this relationship, right? And now the reason is, of course, because we now have the opportunity to do private DNS, right? So in the past, your client was just shouting the domain names it was interested in into the cloud, into the network. I mean, yeah, it knew who it was asking, but it was asking without any cryptographic guarantees, any confidentiality, and anybody on the network could see it. And now that we have this, there's this protected tunnel. And I want to just observe a couple things with this picture that we've got here. So it's not just that there's the red bar that protects the traffic, but actually that there's been an established relationship that wasn't there before, a persistent established relationship. Whereas these queries, the former queries, they were going out into the network based on whatever the IP address happened to be from the DHCP configuration. And it wasn't particularly bound to anything. And now that there is this trust relationship, then there's a whole set of new things that happen in the social dynamics between the operator of the stub and the recursor. So I want to step back and just ask about, like, okay, so this is now there's a relationship between the stub user and the recursor, and it wasn't there before explicitly. And I think what we're looking at is that it's likely to become an explicit relationship. That is, that the user will have some level of knowledge of who they are relying on for their DNS lookups. And so there's this split between explicit and implicit relationships in network communication. And it's a fuzzy split, right, like all of them. But on the one hand, we have this explicit things of, like, if I'm sending you an email, maybe that's an explicit thing where the user has a conception of who they're talking to. Or if we're doing text chat, or maybe I even have an explicit relationship with my email provider. I know that there are some people who don't know who their email provider is, but most people have a general sense that, like, I'm using Google for my email, or I'm using email through my company. Or their search engine of choice, right? I mean, despite the fact that Google is a verb, there is some sense that people have that, like, oh yeah, I'm giving this information to this other entity that's visible to me, or if I have a VPN provider. But the implicit relationships abound on today's network, and most users have no idea that any of these things are there. And it's hard for me to even get pictures of them because they are by definition invisible, right? So there's all these existing implicit relationships, and traditionally the DNS has been that. And now we're sort of potentially moving the DNS resolution into this explicit relationship. So ad networks and CDNs and your operating system and the invisible platform. Some people don't even realize that they're like using Facebook. They just sort of thought Facebook was the internet. And those sort of implicit relationships might need to go away if we want to say that people can actually rely on private DNS. So, okay, so I want to talk about what the trust relationship is between the user and their resolver. And so trust is a really slippery word, and in most cases, when I hear someone use the word trust, I ask them to back up, erase the word, and pick some other way of describing it. So I'm violating that here in this talk. But I want to just point out that there's at least two incredibly different views of trust that are really widely shared, sometimes by the same people. And one of them is the sort of normal human conception of trust of like, this is an organization or a person or a corporation or whatever that's cool, that's not going to do a bad thing. And then there's the security perspective of trust, where we say that a system is a trusted system when it can do terrible things to you and you have no ability to prevent it from doing so, right? And those are in some sense the same definition, but the point of view is totally switched, right? A trusted system is one that can violate the boundaries that you wish they would not violate, and you can't do anything about it. You have to trust them to do it. That's a trusted system. Whereas the normal human conception of trust is, this is someone who is trustworthy. This is someone who is not going to violate these boundaries. And so I think what we need to be doing as we're thinking about operating these services and as we're thinking about standing up clients that can talk to them, that can expose the user to the establishment of this relationship, that what we need to do is we need to be very clear about what are those violations that could happen. And we should try to avoid as much as possible the private resolver being the security sense of trusted, and find ways, if we can, to provide for the private resolver to be trustworthy and explicitly, visibly trustworthy, so that the user doesn't have to just rely on them being trusted. Does that make sense in this split in these definitions? I apologize for using the same word in these two different ways, but as a community we do that, and I think it's worth just sort of laying it out. So I want to talk about a couple different, actually several different violations, and I've got simple names for them, and you've probably all thought about them, but maybe haven't thought about them in the context of your relationship with your DNS resolver. So violation 1 is bad data, right? I talk to my DNS resolver, the DNS resolver is supposed to give me actual DNS data from the actual DNS, whatever the actual DNS is. They're not supposed to make stuff up. We know that there are DNS resolvers that do make stuff up. It's not clear that there actually is a single what is the DNS thing for them to necessarily answer, so this is fuzzy. But this is violation 1, right? That a trusted DNS resolver would be able to mess with someone, right? They could give you back a DNS record that points you to an advertising server instead of giving you an NX domain response. We know that happens. That's violation 1, just to keep in mind of what a DNS resolver might do. So violation 2 is that they have an opportunity, the DNS resolver has an opportunity to really profile the user. And we talked about this some in the previous sessions, but the DNS resolver operator can basically, Bert pointed out that like, if you find somebody who looks up his pattern of DNS queries, that's basically Bert. And then from that, you can learn what else Bert is interested in, because you can see all the other domain names that he looks up, right? So there's this act of dossier building, and you might say, oh, well, that's not a trust violation, but it's not clear whether the users will expect that, right? And so I think we need to be careful to try to put ourselves in the shoes of a user who doesn't understand how these things are necessarily working, and ask, are they expecting a dossier to be built about them? And I think in general, the answer will be no, unless they've just they have a totally fatalist, nihilistic perception of the current surveillance state. I'd like to keep that kind of nihilism at bay. Violation 3 is, in addition to figuring out who the person is based on what they're querying, and this is a new type of violation for a DNS resolver that wasn't the case before we had private DNS, before we had these established relationships, is that the DNS resolver can track the user across the internet. There's a number of mechanisms that no matter what tool you're using to provide private DNS, there are cookie-like mechanisms at many different layers that the DNS resolver could use to track individual users as they move around the internet. So if I've configured my local device and it talks to dns.example.com because that's who I've got this trusted relationship with, dns.example.com can now see me when suddenly I pop up in San Diego at a conference. They can see me when I go to my partner's house for dinner. They can see me when I'm at work, and they can learn where I go around the internet because I have this established long-term relationship, right? That's that red bar that we were looking at in the transition establishes a link that allows the DNS resolver to do that kind of tracking that wasn't possible before. Trust violation 4 is to identify me when I'm inside a LAN. So again, some users have the general sense that like I'm on a LAN, I'm on the local network. At least if I'm on the local network, all my queries are mixed in with the queries of everybody else who's on the local network, right? There's a local network resolver. My queries go to them. They mix them in and they send it out to the outside. Now, how well mixed that actually is a question of research, I think. And I suspect if you researched it adversarially, you'd find it actually isn't particularly well mixed. But there is an expectation from a lot of people that if you're behind the LAN, you are at the very least anonymous within the network itself, right? We're all here at NDSS. The network queries that I look up from within NDSS are going to be the same. No one's going to know who from NDSS learned about it without going to the NDSS server operator. But now, if all of us are connected to our own DNS resolvers and we have these established channels, they can suddenly differentiate and say, aha, I can see that this is a query coming from Paul and this is a query coming from DKG, and pick these queries apart even when without private DNS we would have been mixed behind the LAN. Another violation is this idea of leaking to a third party, and I think this is what some of the concerns around passive DNS and leaking at the resolver, and this kind of leak can be done both deliberately and accidentally, right? It could be done with things like client subnet, which we were just discussing earlier. It can be done with a client ID extension. It could be done by having logs lying around that you're not careful about, that got backed up someplace, and now somebody else has a copy of the logs. It could be done by failing to anonymize or pseudonymize in the way that Bert was talking about the traffic information that it has, right? And so the server operator, because they suddenly have this established relationship with all of the users, now can actually leak additional information to third parties that the user might not do. And this might be information about malware usage, but it might also be information that gets the user in trouble with the local authorities, or gets the user fired from their job, or causes the user to have disastrous personal relationships, or who knows what the kind of leak could be. So violation 6 of the trust is this idea of a correlation between users. So maybe I'm not interested in you specifically, but I want to know, say, who's in a business cartel. Like I want to look for patterns of business cartels. So I could look through my logs of data and I could look for users who have interesting query profiles that, like unusual query profiles that happen to match a small number of other users, right? So I don't even need to have a specific thing that I'm targeting or a specific user that I'm targeting to highlight that a small subgroup exists and use that as the basis for additional investigation. And a user who selects a long-term DNS provider is not necessarily agreeing to show up in that kind of analysis. And again, that's more powerful once you have specific user tracking capabilities, once the dossier building capabilities are there. In violation 7, we don't often think of this as a trust violation, but it is if I'm relying on the network operator. This is being unavailable when it's needed. If I'm trying to look up a domain name and your network is offline or unreachable, then that is a damaging thing in terms of the user trust, right? The user needs to be able to expect to do DNS lookups when they're trying to. So those are the 7 trust violations that I have, and I realized in earlier discussion that I'm missing an 8th one, which is simply not providing enough mixing. And I apologize, this isn't in the slides, but this is based on the basic idea that anonymity loves company. If I'm using a DNS provider that does all of the things right and doesn't violate any 7 of these things, but I'm the only person using it, then it doesn't actually provide me with any privacy, because the DNS resolver is out there basically acting as a proxy of me on the public network, right? It'd be like using a VPN where you're the only user of that VPN. So, so there's a sort of sweet spot between I'm going to control all of the DNS resolution in the whole world, and now my interests are unlikely to be aligned with any of the individual users that I have, and I'm going to only be the DNS resolver for one individual person, because now I'm not actually providing them with any sort of mixing or protection. So there's a question of how we go from this trusted aspect to a trustworthy aspect. And I've got technical measures that I think are worth adopting, and I've got social measures that I think are worth adopting, and then there's some sort of third-party ecosystem stuff that we could look at. I'm a little bit low on time, so I'm going to kind of breeze through some of these, but I can go into them in more detail. If people have questions, I'm happy to talk more. From the client's perspective, the client can keep the DNS resolver out of the trusted category, meaning try to keep it honest in a few different ways. And this doesn't defend against all the different violations that I've mentioned, potential violations that I mentioned. But the client can pad its queries, right? That reduces the amount of leakage just in the network connection, in the network traffic for traffic analysis overall. They can demand DNSSEC signatures and verify them directly. That protects against the bad data violation. They can send an EDNS0 extended client subnet that's set with all zeros, saying, please do not. So you're asserting to the server, please do not identify my IP address to the resolvers that you're sending stuff out to. The client can opt to not do TLS session reuse. So I mentioned that there are many different cookie-like mechanisms. Once you have long-term established connections like this, TLS sessions are one of those, right? So the TLS server says, if you want to connect to me again, we can do a faster setup next time by establishing a TLS session. Clients are going to be tempted to do that because latency is king. But reusing a session means that you've just reestablished all the queries from the previous session with all the queries with the next session, and those are now linkable on the server side. If you avoid session reuse, you can avoid those things being directly linkable, although they might still be linkable at the data layer, right? Just like, if Bert's constantly querying those same 5 things in each session reuse, TLS session reuse isn't going to make a big difference. You can also limit the session lifetime, so only send a certain number of queries over a session before you establish a new one that's independent. You can decline EDNS0 cookies if they're offered. Using DNS over TLS, there shouldn't be any cookies because it's all TCP anyway. The client can establish verify the server's identity, right? So that's one of the ways to make sure that you are still talking to the same person. And lastly, we know, as Philip pointed out, we have these onion addresses. As a server operator, you could run your DNS server out of an onion address as well. There's no reason not to. And that provides the client with some level of guarantee that you don't know as much about them as you would have otherwise. Of course, if the client reuses TLS sessions across the Tor connection, then the linkability is still there. On the resolver side, technically, I would hope that the resolver would pad responses. Again, that protects against traffic analysis on the link between the resolver and the client. It should support the DNSSEC chain extension to be able to rapidly provide full DNS verification for the clients. It should never emit client ID or extended client subnet. Or if it does send the ECS, it should at least respect the client's request if the client requests to mask it. It should not require any sort of session IDs or cookies to operate. You're going to have people who want to use them just for the latency gain. So I can't imagine that you would say, we're going to turn these features off. But if you do offer it, you should make sure that it's not basically a requirement for clients to use it. Additionally, I just want to point out that there's some potential work coming up that offers blinded session tickets. This is not something that we have in production right now, but there are people who are working on it that have a way where that a server can basically say, here's a way to get a new session ticket that I won't be able to correlate with your previous session without a significant amount of work. And that uses a blinded signature scheme so that the server can verify that it is a correct session without being able to tie it back to the sessions that it offered in the past. That's not something that is currently functional, but it would be, I think it would be a great thing for a server operator who wants to be considered trustworthy and not just trusted to make available as a DNS resolver. Committing to a public identity, a long-term public identity, and getting authenticated in as many different ways as you can, right? If you like, we've got the X509 system. It's kind of a disaster, but you might as well, like, it doesn't hurt to ask them to identify you that way. And we've got DNSSEC, which is a different kind of disaster, but it also doesn't hurt to be able to identify yourself that way too. So just, you know, whatever means are available, commit to a long-term stable public identity. And again, offering an onion service for users who want to do that. Socially, it's a little more open-ended. And I know this is a technical crowd, but I want us to remember that all of these questions about trust and trustworthiness are not just technical questions. And their results have effects on people's lives and on you know, what happens outside of the technical realm. I'm going to focus here on the questions about what the resolvers can do. The DNS resolver should minimize logs, right? There's no technical way that the client can enforce that the server minimizes logs. And that log minimization might mean just not keeping any logs. It might mean only keeping logs around for a certain period of time. It might mean keeping logs around for a certain period of time using IP, you know, format preserving encryption in the way that Bert had talked about. But that kind of minimization as a regular policy is something that the resolver can do, but can't prove to the client that they're doing. What they can do is they can make a public statement, a documentation of what their policies are that say, this is what we're doing. And they can stick to those public policies. And if they get a request for data or if their systems get hacked, then they can turn back to those policies and they can say, look, we've had these policies. This is what we've been doing for a long time. We simply don't have this data available to us. Or the data that was leaked as a result of this compromise was you know, only the last 24 hours and not, you know, your lifetime of DNS lookups. And so making a public commitment to those policies is a meaningful step. Again, it's not a technical measure that the user can check, but it's a meaningful step that I think people who want to be in this trusted position should be taking. And then there's transparency reports, right? We see websites, social media platforms offering these transparency reports these days. They basically say, here's a number of requests we've gotten from law enforcement. Here's a number of requests we've gotten from intelligence agencies. To the extent that we can give you these details, and they describe the number of users that were affected and so forth. Having a standard transparency report would be a great model for anyone who's hoping to run a public DNS resolver that they hope to be in the trusted and trustworthy space. From the client, there's a bunch of things that they can do that aren't necessarily gonna force the servers into a more trustworthy position. And I'm not even sure about all of these. I'd be curious if people have other suggestions for what clients can do. The things I've listed up here are spreading their queries across multiple resolvers so that no one resolver has access to their full data set. I'm not actually convinced, given patterns of DNS traffic, that would be useful. It seems like you might just be letting multiple resolvers violate your trust. You could do chaff lookups. Again, that is, in addition to looking up the things that you're interested in, you could just look up all kinds of other stuff. That's a hard question technically in terms of figuring out what's the other stuff you could look up. And secondly, it's not clear that any chaff lookup strategy couldn't just be filtered by large enough statistical data sets on the other side. So I don't know how effective that would be, but that's an interesting research project if someone wants to look into it. And finally, if the client observes that the server has misbehaved in some way, has failed to identify themselves properly, has given them bad data, has failed to pad their responses, they should document it and log it and make that kind of information available. And I know that's not going to be something that most normal users are going to be able to do something about, but if the client is capable of at least logging that information, then it would be good to have a way to sort of publish that stuff. That brings me to this question of what can third parties do? So a third party who wants to keep the option for trustworthy DNS private resolvers would probably be interested in monitoring those sorts of reports that maybe a client could generate. Set up ways to try to measure whether the third-party resolver is sending eDNS 0 client ID, right, or the client subnet. Check if they're filtering anything that they shouldn't be filtering, if they're modifying the data as it goes through. Check to make sure that they're available, right? I mean, a good, trustworthy private resolver will be available as much time as possible. And again, if the blind and TLS session tickets are functional, there are some scoping checks you can do to ensure that the server is not sort of fake blinding those, which have to do with schedules of key rotation. I can go into the details on anybody who is interested later. I don't think this is the talk for the crypto details. But so that's a range, sort of a range of how I hope people will try to start thinking about the trust relationships that we're establishing by bringing up these tools. You probably have some other ideas of trust violations that might occur or of mitigation measures, and I'd be curious to hear them. And we should be publicizing them and trying to document what sort of best practices are as operators in the community. So if folks have questions, I'm happy to talk afterwards. I know that we're running a little bit late, but I would love it if people have questions, if we get a little bit of a chance to get people to come up to the mic and ask them now as well. Am I okay on the time?
Stay there for a minute. We actually also can talk about this during the panel about adoption and operation. And there's some discussion about creating operator-related operational guides that may be a good place for some of this work to happen.
Yep, operator and client implementation.
And client, right. And when we talk about usable security, it's both the client implementation and the client's awareness that get involved in that too. So we have lots of opportunities here. Great. So I think you stay here because the next thing we're doing is the panel on HTTP over TLS, on Dodo. DNS over HTTPS. So would the panelists come up here and join the little conclave? And Melinda, I guess you're. Yeah. Should I stay here? I think you're going to have to come up. Okay. So this is our experiment in a panel where people are clustered. I'll get out of the way.
You know, in traditional bluegrass music, bands perform with one mic. Everybody clusters around.
We may need to pull up some slides, though. Do you want to do that?
Okay. How does Paul feel about the slides?
Yeah. Do the other panelists have slides?
No.
But you do.
I do.
Of course. Yeah. Okay.
Okay, and they're there. Do you need my help, Melinda?
I think I can get it.
Why don't the panelists introduce yourselves?
Hi, I'm DKG. I was just here.
Okay.
Hi, I'm Ben Schwartz. I work for Google.
And I'm Paul Hoffman. I'm with ICANN. I'm in the CTO's office research area. So, and how we relate to this is I'm one of the co-authors of the main Dodo draft, and Ben's one of the working group co-chairs. Cool.
There we go.
Take it away, or we'll move that.
All right.
Style, yes.
Yeah. So I think at this point, you know, up until now, when we're talking about DNS privacy, we're typically talking about DNS over TLS, but a new, at least in IETF time, effort has started up to standardize DNS queries over HTTPS. To provide protection and maybe a little bit of obfuscation as well. And so that's what we're going to talk about during this panel. Paul's the primary author on the document, and
no.
You know.
No, God, no.
Okay, so
I'm one of the two co-authors.
Okay, so he's an author, and then we've got implementers and people who are involved with the DNS privacy space as well. So an obvious place to start. The two obvious places to start are, number one, what it actually is, because that's not always been clear to people. And the other is, you know, what are the trade-offs with this, you know, versus, privacy trade-offs with this versus DNS over TLS. So probably start with.
Actually, do you want to do the difference between Dodo and DNS over HTTP since you're implementing them? I'm DNS over TLS. Do you want to do a quick one on that?
Okay.
Okay.
Hey, so well, if you haven't, if you're not one of the people who's intimately involved with this, you might not know that DNS over TLS is sort of a one-line draft. It's a protocol that can be described in one sentence.
Yeah.
It says take the DNS over TCP protocol that was defined in 1986, I think, and do it over TLS. That's the whole protocol. The DNS over HTTPS proposal that we're reviewing in the Dodo working group is slightly more involved, but really only takes about 2 sentences to describe. That one is take your DNS query packet and encode it in a completely trivial way into a DNS query, send that to a server.
Into a DNS query?
I'm sorry, into an HTTP query, send that over HTTPS to the server and get that.
That idea.
That was amazing.
That was pretty amazing.
Uh,
I told Sarah it would be disruptive, and it was indeed.
Yeah, the problem is we're not sharing those slides on Zoom. They're only being shared in Zoom.
Okay.
So,
yeah, so it's that time. The second sentence is in Dodo.
but it's
You
not
can
green
either
around
take
it.
the
So
binary
green is
contents
around
of your
it.
DNS query packet, drop it into the body of an HTTP
Maybe
post request, and send that to the server, or you can base64 it and drop it into the URL in a particular URL parameter or a particular path, which is I'll let Paul talk about. And either way, you get back the binary response as the HTTP.
Yes.
Okay, so now you want to share your slides. Where are your slides again?
There.
Okay. And are we all happy now?
Did we
Except
check
that
the
it's
audio?
over Zoom.
Did people hear the? Yes, audio's good, says Sarah. Okay, we're back.
Even better.
The microphone is good for us.
So I have to do sort of both. Okay. Okay. So, well, here, since we're sort of, let me, sorry, so I'll start back here. So we've got two different ways of doing what we want, which is protecting DNS in TLS. And what I'm going to cover here briefly, and we can be talking about more, is from a security standpoint, from a pure cryptographic standpoint, they are the same because they're both running under TLS. However, as we've all discovered, anytime that you're doing security, you have some configuration. You try to hide as much configuration as you can from the user. And in that hiding, you actually make it harder, some things harder and some things easier. And that's what I'm actually going to cover right now, which is that DNS over TLS, the way that we've been doing it for a few years, is done in the operating system. But DNS over HTTPS, which we just call DO, which should be spelled D''OH!, is running in browsers. And that's mostly true. That's not completely true. The user's configuration of their operating system is very different than the user's configuration of their browser. Very, very, very few users understand how to configure their operating system. They wouldn't know how to change their DHCP, settings or whatever, even if you were telling them on the phone at the time. Many users know how to configure their browser. They are aware that there is a preferences thing. They don't use it often, but they have some awareness of it. And sometimes they've actually done it on purpose, that someone said, oh, you'll get more security if you do this thing. And it's, for many users, it's painful to go through the preferences, but it's not nearly as painful as an operating system. So that's one of the places where, and really what we want is everybody to do some sort of DNS over some sort of TLS. So here the question is which of the configuration settings is going to bring us the most user value? And the way that these will be configured are going to be very different. Configuration under DO is likely to be a full URL. And that's not completely clear now. This is what we are discussing in the DO working group in the IETF right now. When you do DNS over TLS, if you get to configure it, which we hope more people get to so that it comes on, this is done with either an IP address or a domain name. Mostly an IP address. Some places allow a domain name. So again, like I said, if a user has to touch the configuration, you've pretty much lost most of those users. So really what we're relying on is what will be the defaults in the operating system or in the browser. And so what we come down to, is this going to be turned on by default? We don't know. It's still very early. Even though we've had DNS over TLS for a few years, there's still very, very little adoption. So little that we can't tell of the adoption that is there. Is this just advanced users who wanted the feature, or are we getting some good defaults in? This talk 2 or 3 years from now should be radically different. I don't know how it will be different, but at least it'll have more data. So the way that for doing the DNS over TLS configuration options, you can turn it on by default. Some operating systems might have it already on already, and we'll have a talk on that actually quite soon. You might be able to enter it manually, depends on your operating system. The most important part here is the fact that almost everybody gets their DNS server through DHCP, and there still is no way there's no way in DHCP to say, please turn on DNS over TLS at this address. There is no DHCP option on that. For DO, since this is still actively, we're still in the middle of the discussion of this in the IETF. There are currently 3 different things that the working group is discussing. The first one, which was that there was a URL that you would always use and you would do your query. That's what we used in the first couple of drafts. That has now been eliminated, and we've been told we are not allowed to do that because it goes against the IETF standards. The second bullet here is saying you can still use a URL on a site and say, do you offer DO services, and if so, at which URLs?
Do you think maybe you could just back up and explain what IETF standards the first thing goes against? Because people here might not know what IETF
I don't
standards
remember.
is.
Okay, I don't actually remember the name, but some of you have seen URLs that I was about to point here. That
This is
doesn't help. The dot Wellknown. No. This has to do with dot Wellknown. So the use of dot Wellknown is a standard in the IETF. And what you're allowed to use dot Wellknown for is up to one person, the expert, and who also wrote the document. And the standard says that you are not allowed to use dot Wellknown as a URL prefix to essentially carve out a set of URLs, which is exactly what we did in the first draft. So that's a no-no. The second one, which I am certainly going to be proposing, is that one of the things you are supposed to be able to use dot Wellknown for is to identify policies and services of a website. It is perfectly believable by some of us that, in fact, this website has a DO server on it, is a policy or service that should be discoverable. Not clear if this is going to pass muster or not. If we can do the second one, that's great, because that makes automatic configuration easy. That is, so when you go to, if you were going to example.com, your browser could also look if there is a DO server there. And if you have said, I trust this a lot, or you have some policy that you already told your browser you like this, it would be able to discover the URL to use for DO. The third one, which is where we're sort of stuck now, is that each different server, each website is going to have their own URL for DO. So it would not be discoverable in a normal fashion or in a secure fashion. It would not be discoverable with the same security the DO itself has. There's other ways to discover things, but so you would have to know, oh, if I trust Google as a DO server, I have to go to www.google.com/DO. But if I trust Yandex as a DO server, I'd have to go to www.yandex.ru/ and then probably something that looks like DNS-over-HTTP in Russian or whatever. So you would have to choose it, which means users are going to have to get out of band this URL and type it in. Or that there's going to have to be a list in browsers of their favorite ones, which of course makes it harder for everyone else. And that was it. Okay, so that was my presentation.
So, yeah, I think it's interesting that your presentation is specifically about, your focus here is on configuration questions, which
Yes.
I agree are a major challenge. And I want to highlight that one of the things that I find intriguing about DO is the fully configurationless mode of sort of promiscuous DNS gathering from arbitrary places. And
Right, which is not at all anything that anyone is expecting.
well, so here's the scenario that I just sort of want to paint. If DO is functional, and people have DNSSEC in a zone, and I'm on this website, and the website sends me some traffic, sends me a web page that has some links, outbound links, and at the same time, using a server push-ish like thing, sends me its .wellknown DNS query thing, and says, by the way, there's this URL that there's this URL pattern that you might be interested in, and by the way, I'm going to server push-ish this stuff to you again. Here are some answers. Should you have asked me this DNS question? And now all of a sudden I've got the DNS answers, and they're all DNS signed, and I can verify it. And I didn't even have to ask them for them. And there's no configuration involved at all. And it's basically saying DNS is a data set.
Yes.
You can slide it around however you like, as long as you cryptographically verify it. It's just another way. It doesn't have to be on 453. And so that, to my mind, is a completely configuration-free thing that DO offers us that DNS over TLS does not.
Hi. So I would say DO, this is something that's really interesting to me, and I've spent some time thinking about it, talking to people about it. I think DO is sort of the first step foundation for a bunch of interesting stuff, and that's definitely one of the most interesting. But I think it's really also potentially pretty pretty challenging and pretty scary. The biggest thing that I worry about is basically load balancing. So if you do any kind of multi-IP address load balancing, to a huge bank of front-end servers serving one website, and if you have one high-volume portal, like a search engine, that delivers people to that website, then with DNSSEC, there's nothing preventing that search engine from just serving all users a single IP address for your domain. And while that's not something that a smart search engine would do on purpose unless they were being sort of weirdly malicious, it is an easy failure mode to imagine, I think, where basically you now are delegating your load balancing to the user's search engine in a way that could, if it fails, can wind up with some large fraction of all your users being directed to a single front-end node.
But the same is true if you've got a DNS over TLS, if you've got one major resolver that everyone's using. If that resolver decides to, under DNSSEC, I can serve up whatever records are signed for this, right?
Yes.
And so
Right.
I think we have the same problem.
And we also have the same problem with the extension in the DNS for client subnet, where when the client says, this is my address, so please optimize your answers for me, it's very easy to take those and do dumb things as well. So DOE maybe gives you an equivalent way to do dumb things, but or a new equivalent way to do dumb things. But there's already so many, and they are equivalent. I don't think that adding one actually makes it any more difficult.
So I think there's an interesting operational consideration here about whether search engines and basically website operators generally are going to be, on average, reliable enough in handling this kind of load balancing that browser vendors will be willing to sort of delegate this to them in a way that can potentially break third-party websites. There's a bunch of parties in here where now basically any search engine can potentially create a highly focused denial of service attack accidentally on any major website.
Right.
Which they can still do, even without DNS over TLS, right?
Right.
The search engine is very well positioned to create denial of service attacks. You search for kittens, guess what? It's this website, right? And everyone's going to go there because you search for kittens. And I'm not saying that any search engine, but the configurationless mode that I was describing isn't just for search engines, right? Any website that wants to could push DNSSEC signed chains to anybody who's visiting them.
So to be clear, you have to say to your browser, when I go to this site, this domain name, this URL, however site gets defined, and that's a completely different discussion, I will trust them to do DNS for me. And the reason why you would do that is it's coming under the same TLS connection and things like that. If you haven't said that, the browser's not going to have you do that. If you have said that and you've given a long list and you're at any of those sites, you're going to get this. So you are opening up the capability for a site that you already are trusting for some information to give you more information. And, oh yeah, Wes, you have to come up here. Standing, but standing at an empty microphone stand is not useful.
Okay, so I have Wes Hardiker, USC. I have a list of 15 clarifying questions.
Okay.
It's long. You can go. Yeah. No, I'll just do one. So the interesting thing to me is that the way you guys have done a good job explaining various usage forms, and so to me that's always been the question in my mind: what's the motivation? And specifically for this group, how do we get toward the privacy aspects of it? I sort of was before believing that sort of your resolver would sort of offer a HTTPS-like mechanism so that you could send all of your queries. So that when you were talking about a user having to enter a URL, then that to me says the user's going to enter their resolver URL and stuff is going to go that way. Or right now you guys have been talking about Wellknown. So when I go to google.com, all requests, future DNS requests triggered by that web page will go through Google's HTTPS server. But if I go to a different page, I might use their site, because you gave an example of example.com. I'm going to follow on with 1 second, and then I'm going to turn it all back over.
Okay.
So you use the example of, if I go to example.com and it says .wellknown, and I discover that it does DNS services, then I will use it. But
No,
can't, right.
will.
But if I discover thousands of sites, I'm really only sending it per web page. So here's my privacy question for this group. Okay, good.
Not at all.
Okay, I'll let you answer.
So let me do high level. If you read the document, you will see the use cases. And those are very, very clear in the document. Many of the ones that you just suggested are not in the document, and some of them are must not in the document. Okay. The use case really is that we want people who would stop you from using encrypted DNS from being able to stop you easily. And the way to do that is, if you are already at or would likely go to a particular TLS protected server that they don't want to block you from because it's popular, it's big, or whatever, then you can run DNS there as well. So it's not that you would go to 1,000 sites, find that they all do this, and say, oh, I don't care about any of them. You do care. You would have had specified which ones you care about. And common use cases are in the United States, like Google and Facebook, things that people leave tabs open, or Twitter and Instagram, things like that, where people would leave a tab open all day. That way, no one's going to block those thinking that you're doing DNS. That's the basic use case, that somebody who would block you from doing encrypted DNS would be less likely to block you if you are doing it at a site that they don't want to be seen as blocking you from.
So really, because they can't distinguish between your DNS queries and your HTTP queries.
Exactly right. Exactly right. And so your last one of, that maybe you would enter the URL of your normal resolver. Well, no, that doesn't get you anywhere at all. Someone's going to block that just as much as they would have blocked DNS over TLS.
But the only reason that they're blocking DNS over TLS is because it's on port 853, and port 853 is visible to the network adversary.
Yep.
And port 443 is not, right? I mean, I've demonstrated that you can multiplex HTTP 1.1 and DNS over the same port.
We sat through that one.
I'm just saying, like, if the goal is indistinguishability, there are other mechanisms as well.
Right. So were you going back to another mic, or were you?
No,
Okay.
So yeah, I think that, as you can see, there's a funny thing that happens when you spend enough time thinking about something. You walk down some long logical chain, and it becomes difficult to remember how it is we ended up there. But yeah, this is there's a sort of forecasted competition between people who are trying to control users' access to DNS, try to get them to use particular DNS servers,
Their server,
and clients who are sort of in this mental model perceived as trying to choose, having a desire to choose a particular server. And so then if you sort of walk that game to completion, the best outcome that we could see for the user is to find a protocol whose public identifiers, whose unencrypted information is all, as much as possible, completely indistinguishable from
normal
other
traffic,
things that are happening.
From unblockable traffic.
or less
Unobjectionables. We sometimes call it high collateral value.
Mm-hmm.
High collateral value, as opposed to high collateral damage.
Yes.
Yeah. So okay, I think we've talked through that quite a bit.
Yeah. So and you had a different talk you were going to go.
I have slides that's scheduled at a particular slide.
I know. I thought within this thing. Oh, you were just up here. So anyways, let me just go back. So Wes and anyone else listening, please do read the document, because it is very specific. And going to what Ben was just saying, it's easy to get it wrong and say, I want this, and your hammer looks like it's approximately the right size, therefore you thought of my use case. And because this is an IETF activity that is, can create lots of different hammers. We were very highly constrained from day one to limit it to exactly what Ben was just saying.
So I want to pose.
And if we haven't done that well, we're going to get limited in the future on that. So like if it's not in the, if the limits aren't in the document now, they will get at it.
So I want to just sort of pose the question here of, if I hold for it under whatever transport, if I happen to get a signed DNSSEC chain to some data,
Yep.
who's telling me I'm not allowed to use it?
You are allowed to use it.
Okay.
So
I'm just saying that, like, we can say we're going to use it for this, but it's going to, like, cat's out of the bag once the cat's out of the bag.
The cat's only out of the bag, though, if the browser accepts that information.
Yep.
And so some browsers might and some might not.
You've got latency and you've got addition. So this is the second privacy leakage thing.
But remember, none of the browsers have DNSSEC validators in them currently.
Yeah, sure, they don't. They also don't have DNS-over-HTTPS currently, right? But so
they've had longer to put in DNSSEC validation and have ignored it.
Absolutely, because the
the
transports have been totally unreliable. Right?
Okay.
So there is an additional privacy win that you get from the opportunistic DNSSEC validated configurationless mode.
Yes.
And that privacy win is that you establish no additional data channels to figure out the DNS, right? So instead of going to the website, getting a web page that has some links that you might want to click on, and then going to the DNS server and leaking the list of domain names to your DNS resolver, and then going to the different sites, you just dropped that entire extra leg.
Mm-hmm.
And in the opportunistic configuration-free mode, this gives you a latency win because the session's already established and the data's pumped down the channel, and a privacy win. And it's not often that you get both. And I think that's going to be a very tempting thing for browser vendors to do.
So I would love you to be right, and I doubt it.
So I really am interested in this, and I would love us to find a version of this that we can do. There are still other things to worry about here. One of them is super cookies.
Yep.
So if you imagine that there's that I host my web server at a huge range, at 100 billion different IPv6 addresses, then I can serve a different one through this channel.
You're serving your own domain.
No, no. You just allowed him to push anything that's DNSSEC signed.
Right.
So if some domain has DNSSEC signed a wide variety of IP addresses, then I can pick and choose which of those I serve to different users, which then creates an unencrypted publicly visible identifier for that user in subsequent traffic, even if it's to a domain that's not controlled by the same party that was serving the DNS records. I think this is really interesting, but there are a lot of really, really fun, subtle, potentially scary privacy issues. Go for it.
Yeah, I'm afraid we've just got limited time left.
Okay,
So if you guys want to do like a 1 minute each summary statement to close it out, or
Okay.
And we'll also invite the audience to participate, since this is all work in progress.
yeah, absolutely.
As you can see, it's not settled.
You have had you've been looking like you wanted to ask questions for a while. Why don't you come up and ask it?
I haven't read the paper, so I feel
Okay.
like some.
No, but you just looked like you were like wanting to ask a question. And we can talk all day.
No, I'll wait till I get
Okay,
you guys
but we will.
one-on-one, so
Yeah.
I'm-
Okay, sorry.
Come to the, bring it around the mic.
Yeah.
Eric Zegas, Farsight again. Looking on how to install, when people want to choose a different resolver to use, they don't want to use their hotel, they don't want to use their coffee shop, they don't want to be a black hat and have everyone put them on the wall of sheep, they choose which one to use. Let's say 8.8.8.8, they'll use Cloud9, they'll use OpenDNS, or whatever is out there that they know and trust to work for them. It doesn't seem like either of these, where DNS over TLS looks like it has a client you can download and use on your PC. The DNS over HTTPS, it doesn't really look like it has anything supporting it. You have to actually have your applications, your web browsers, or whatever, buy into whatever the service is. Now we've got this chicken and egg problem. where
We had the
we don't.
problem for DNS over TLS as well.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
And this is
And yet
ongoing.
browsers already exist.
Okay. So what can be done to make it, or how is it best? How do we get through that part where we have services available? What are some technology we can use for auto discovery, such that I can get to the one I want to use?
Mhm.
I have a service I want to use. How do I get to it reliably?
That's what this slide is all about, unfortunately. So that has not been answered in the working group. We hope to know within 2 months. But for many of the reasons that DKG is positively cited and Ben is worried, discovery is going to be very contentious. For anyone who's coming to the IETF meeting in London and going to the DOE working group, I believe that this will probably be the thorniest discussion with the longest mic line. So the one short thing I would say to help us wrap up is that what we are seeing is a lot of interest in being able to trust somebody, to know who to pick again. Who are you getting your DNS from? You don't get to do it in your operating system, basically. Most people don't even know that they can change their DNS server if it comes from DHCP. This will be a bit more visible because it'll be in the browser, and there might be settings or something like that. There will certainly be some settings to turn this on. So that visibility makes it harder to turn on, but it gives them more power. Don't know how that's going to play out.
So I'll just say that when we get to the point of configurability, I don't have the same pessimism that Paul does about having operating systems. People know what the preferences or the settings view is in their operating system, even if they don't use it ever. It's not inconceivable that you could have it there. And I'm actually really excited about the prospect of DNS, like transport agnostic DNS.
So my view is DOE right now is moving toward the point of parity with DNS over TLS, because to get to parity, we need to be a standard. And once we have that, then DOE opens up a Pandora's box of all sorts of interesting, crazy things that you could do. And so, because it interacts with all of the rest of the stuff that's been developed around the web. And that could mean web standards, things like cross-origin resource limitations, where there's all sorts of interesting things you can imagine, interesting questions about what it means for an origin to have told you something about an IP address relative to that page being loaded in that origin's context in an iframe or in a different tab. And it also interacts with all of the sort of commercial technologies related to the web, things like OAuth, where you could potentially have a DNS server that really, really knows who its clients are through all the federated identity systems. So I don't know what's going to happen, but I think it'll be interesting.
Thank you. So let's thank Melinda Shore and the DOE discussers, and I'm avoiding saying the DOE boys, sorry. And we have a very special talk now, which is John Todd from the Packet Clearinghouse, who's going to talk about the Quad 9 DNS over TLS configuration. And let's see if we can get your slides properly up here. Where will we find them? I'm going to stop this share for a minute, and then I'm going to share screen. And oh, it is probably that same one. Yep, but we have to find the other window in preview. Okay, so let's see if we can do that. Okay, so let me find the other window in preview. There's preview. Sorry, we should always allow. Oh, let's previews. Can you see? Oh, here it is. Okay. Let me see if I can bring it up and get. Come on. Oh, we're in full screen mode here. Oh, this is really. Okay, preview. There's a window for yours. Here we are. This should do it. Okay, hopefully that gets us there on Zoom as well. Yeah, okay. Let's just get this window out of the way. And why are we trying
You're
to
not
us?
sharing the desktop yet, or the application, you have to select that. Zoom.
I think I did. I think I did. Did I not?
No, because we're seeing Karen's face in the Zoom.
Okay, let me go back to Zoom again. Did we get logged out of the Zoom?
No, you minimized.
Okay. Yeah, here it is. Okay. No, it says I have to sign into Zoom.
Because you're already.
Okay, so Karen, help us with the Zoom login thing here. Sorry, John.
Sorry.
Okay, so while I'm here, I want to remind you that we'll have one more panel, another bluegrass band up here about DNS adoption, then go to lunch, and when we come back from lunch, we're going to go into the USEC room for an hour to have a joint session with the usable security people, and that will include a demo of working on usability for DNS over TLS, and also to make it perfectly clear, you don't have to go to the IETF in London. You can join the DOE mailing list and the DNS Privacy Deep-Prive mailing list and start participating in these discussions by email, even if you can't make it to IETF. So these are all specifications that are in flight. And if you're not already involved, we would love for you to get involved in the IETF.
Go for desktop one. On that one there. There's a green right there.
Yeah, you don't want that. You want, which one? Which is yours?
I would put desktop.
You want desktop?
Yeah. That way you don't have to worry about switching. There you go. And then move the bar over to the one side or the other. Yeah. And then click presentation. Okay.
Working?
Yes.
Great. Thanks. Hi, my name is John Todd. I'm the Executive Director of Quad 9, which is currently implementing DNS over TLS. We're going to talk a little bit about some of our experiences, practical experiences, and current status to date. Quick background on Quad 9. We've been in operation now for about 4 months publicly, although we've been in operation for about 2 years in total as an open, free public recursor, sponsored by Packet Clearinghouse, Global Cyber Alliance, and IBM. Some key facts, we're a 501c3 not-for-profit. Our goal is specifically just DNS delivery and security. We actually have a block list implemented on the Quad 9 address, 9.9.9.9, for malware, phishing, and other kinds of threats. We have 19 different threat intelligence providers giving us data. Obviously, the memorable address of 9.9.9.9. I'll take this back, right? Okay. So we are very privacy focused, meaning that we do not resell or retransmit user data. And actually, one of the things I missed on this slide is that we actually don't even log user data. IP addresses are never written to disk, and they're never transmitted out of the POP. And that includes, we don't even encrypt them or obfuscate them in any way. They're simply thrown away. So we are very privacy oriented right now. And our goal and our model is not to sell data. Our goal is to give users, end users, security and protection. We actually have several different flavors of our IP address. If you want the blocking version, which actually gives NX domain, we've got about 2 million, I think, domains now that we block. You can use 9.9.9.9 for that. But if you want unblock, meaning if you don't want to actually subscribe to our malware and phishing list, we have just a standard recursor that operates identically, except it doesn't have the blacklist. We have currently 108 locations worldwide on the Anycast mesh. We're in 70 nations and 6 continents. And that number is going to grow this year. I expect about 150. All of these currently are operating DNS over TLS as an additional service. So one of our primary goals, we have 3 primary goals. One is security, give end users protection against malicious events. 2 is performance. Of course, the DNS resolver needs to be at or only slightly slower than what they would experience with a local resolver. So performance is our second goal. And the third is privacy, meaning that end user data is both trusted and trustworthy, to use Dan's summary. So we implemented DNS over TLS, part of the discussions with Sarah in the last couple of months. First as experimental and then as production. And the goals for that were, of course, to improve user privacy, giving that connectivity, that leg between the client and the recursor some protection. We are also doing that to prevent injection spoofing. This actually is a significant issue that we actually have to resolve from a technology level, and I'll talk about that in some of our lessons learned. And that by preventing injection spoofing, you're actually creating an operational problem in certain circumstances, but it disallows people from putting in false results in between the recursor and the client. And then the last thing is, of course, prevent malicious actors from layer 2 or layer 3 hijacking, either at the routing layer or at the MAC address layer, from either injecting or intercepting data to clients. So the first thing we did, as was also described, you put DNS in TLS, right? So pretty simple. You got your peanut butter and my chocolate, or whatever that old ad used to be. So we simply implemented that by putting HA proxy in front of our recursors as a relay with TLS wrappers, and that was actually fairly simple to do. There's well-known tooling on HA proxy for load mitigation, denial of service mitigation, and also for some monitoring. And it's a very well understood protocol. Any of our systems folks can implement that and understand how it worked without risk to the Anycast mesh as a whole. The downside is that it's one more thing to instrument, meaning that we have to put it in the chain of the DNS queries in order to be able to tell what's going on. That adds, of course, another large item in our list of telemetry information. And when you're looking at thousands of implementations, this is not a minor thing. It artificially aggregates our DNS control plane, and by that I mean we have the HA proxy side of things multiplexing multiple end users into a single stream of data that then hits our recursors. And we really have instrumented the recursors as having the best data output, but now we have HA proxy disguising some of that. So we lost some visibility in the implementation stack for what we needed or what we'd like to get. And then signaling loss for detailed analytic, that I guess is those are the same points. So that is current stage 1, that as it is today, we are still using HA proxy. The good news is, and Barrett was on earlier, we are using the Power DNS application called DNS Dist as a front end to our recursors. We have multiple recursors in the back end, but DNS Dist is on the front. So we are going to be implementing the native TLS versions of DNS Dist real soon now, like this week, I suspect. It's currently in our testing environment. This will give us back some of that visibility into the statistics that we've lost with HA proxy and also reduce our complexity by one significant item. So here's what our usage profile is to date, just as some raw numbers. We have, and because we don't store IP addresses, we've had to kind of hack together some ugly ways of tracking endpoints. But we have right around 6,000 unique TLS endpoints that have accessed the service. I couldn't tell you how many queries each one of those does because we don't store that data. So again, kind of the loss of IP address data does have some downsides when you're trying to do certain types of analysis. We actually are seeing good news in that IPv6 is about 15% of what IPv4 is, and that's a significant uptick as compared to our recursive traffic on the non-encrypted side, where we only see we see significantly fewer. We see single-digit percentages of IPv6 on the recursor on the unencrypted formats. One of the usage profile things that's interesting is you can see these big dips we did validate that that was actually happening. It's not simply a statistical. Well, sorry, the one all the way on the right-hand side is false. That's a Grafana artifact. But looking at right around the 1st of February, there was a significant drop-off. We're not sure what caused that. It might have been that there are people testing this that stopped testing it and then re-engaged, or it's uncertain. So we don't have a good usage profile model yet. I think that by moving to the TLS native and DNS dist, we'll have a better understanding of what some of the errors and issues are with the traffic. So as you can see, this graph goes from the day of launch, back when we actually publicly released the project back in November, where there was actually already some usage, and it's been steadily increasing. There are projects such as OpenWRT, I think, that is looking at adding the Quad 9 system in as a TLS option or as a default. And we're looking for more hardware vendors or software vendors to include DNS over TLS as an option with Quad 9. So lessons learned. It just works. We really have had few questions or problems with it, despite the number of people using it. And the people who are using it to date have been very technically minded, so the faults that we have had have been very quickly noticed. We had one issue where we were actually closing sockets way too early. That was picked up fairly quickly, and we've extended that out. I think 20 minutes is our timer now for socket durations. Again, I can't tell how many queries go through that socket because we're not tracking that, but we will in the next versions. The user base is still fairly small. I don't think we have enough data right now to be able to quantitatively say what the impact of this is across the entire network at scale. And that's concerning. We've done certainly tests, but tests are notoriously not equivalent to real-world data unless you have a lot of it. And we haven't had enough of the TLS data to be able to create a model that's adequate for testing at scale. So that's something we're going to be hopefully looking at here in the next quarter, to be able to reproduce that and get enough data from the TLS flows to be able to create a test environment that duplicates it. The EU region is where we're seeing the most number of queries. This is not surprising, with a focus of privacy in countries like Germany and the Netherlands and others. The EU followed by the United States, distributed out across all the locations here. Of course, our tech staff, including myself, I've discovered that PCAP methods of debugging problems becomes impossible because it's encrypted. So you have to add an additional layer on top of your analysis or your quick analysis tools to be able to see what's going on. From an operational perspective, this is actually a significant thing. When people call and say that they have problems resolving a certain domain, you cannot see what's going on at the client level without a lot of additional instrumentation. Things that we need to do in the next steps, meaning moving into that stage 2, we need to publish our keys more regularly, or we actually need to publish them on our website in a public way so that people can validate them. We need to get the native mode implementations in place. One of the biggest things, of course, we need to do is we need to get more clients. Right now, Stubby is the primary client that people are using. In fact, I believe the only client. Am I wrong on that? Any heads shaking in the audience? I think Stub. Okay, so KResD is another option. But we need to get more clients that are capable of supporting DNS over TLS. We hope that kind of by being the chicken in the chicken and egg conversation of, well, there are no big resolvers that support DNS over TLS because there are no clients that support it. There are no clients that support it because there are no servers that support it. We're hoping that by deploying this on a large scale, we can encourage encryption with both DNS over TLS and also other methods like DOH, which will also be a fairly early adopter of when it becomes standardized in some fashion. But we need more clients. And so I hope that by doing this, we can move the conversation forward on getting better encryption for stub to resolver path. We also haven't really examined what it does to client performance. And that's probably going to be something that's done more by the client-side folks, but we don't know what the changes are, if any, to recursion delay. It actually might improve it under certain circumstances, but we don't have the data yet to really prove it one way or the other. So that's it. That's all I've got. I am actually interested in taking questions. You could configure your resolvers right now to use it if you have Stubby on your machines. But I'll open for questions unless there's anything else.
5 minutes for questions.
5 minutes, all right.
Come on up.
You can just repeat the question.
Will do.
How well do you integrate with CDN geographic geolocation?
How well do we integrate with CDN geographic location? So that doesn't have anything to do with the TLS side because we treat the TLS queries the same as we do our regular recursion. So you're asking about extended client subnet or not?
If I make a query through your service, if I'm using a single name server that's unicast on the internet, it'll look like I'm just always at that name server at that location. I understand your Anycast. Are you doing integration with routing policy or with CDNs to make sure that people are geolocated?
So the question is, what does Quad 9 do to improve CDN delivery? So there's two methods to do that. One, of course, is extended client subnet, ECS, where we would transmit the first octets or hextets to the CDNs that they would know where you as the origin were coming from. So the answer is yes on that. We will do that. You can basically pick and choose what privacy level you want by picking what IP address you use on the Quad 9 array. So 9.9.9.9 does not send ECS because that is treated as a privacy violation. However, 9.9.9.10 at some point in your future will actually send ECS because that's the unsecured IP address. And then there are other IP addresses which let you do things like, all right, I want the block list, but I don't want to send ECS, or I want the block list and I do want to send ECS. You can use different IP addresses in our array to choose that. Secondly, we're also transmitting lists of geographic coordinates for our exit IP addresses to CDN providers. So we have a spreadsheet which outlines every one of the networks and/or hosts that is sending queries outbound, and we can tell you what city it's in. And like if you give that to MaxMind or any of the other IP2 location databases, they'll put that in their tables so that eventually that filters its way down to even people that we don't have a direct relationship with. But we've been sending spreadsheets to the different CDN providers saying, here are our exit IP addresses, so that they can, based on the exit IP address, they can make a rough guess as to where the end user is. But that's imperfect to say the least. But it's better than nothing. Daniel?
So right now, so are you, is HA proxy forwarding the client IP address to our DNS in order to be able to, first of all, make this determination about how many users there are, secondly, to be able to ECS?
So Ben's question is HA proxy forwarding the client IP address? And the answer right now is no, it is not. It is clearing that state and sending it off, and we see the address, or we see the query coming in to the resolver as if it was generated on localhost. So we're not sending that through, and that's one of the reasons we need to get away from HA proxy, because it's not a. There are models where you can actually send that through, but we chose not to implement that. It got complicated very quick. So now I'll go to Daniel because he's.
I have two questions. The third one was, do you have plans to implement response padding? I know that it's currently not padded. And the second question was whether you run into problems with any casted TLS session resumption issues. Like how do you locally manage sessions?
Sure. So Daniel's two questions. Well, I'll ask the first question first, which is, are we planning on doing padding? And the answer is we will put that. In fact, that I think I've had that discussion with Barrett. But the answer is yes, we would be interested in that. But that's going to rely on our software, the request for what is the DNS dist version of TLS?
So DNS did it.
Yes. Yes, we would be up for doing it if DNS just did it. And then the second question is, do we handle session renegotiation? Do we keep state globally? And the answer is no, we don't. So if routing changes and in any cast destination, where a client suddenly goes to a different location, their session is broken, and then they reestablish with the other session. We find that is extremely rare. What extremely being a relative term, right? But on the whole, that's a fairly rare thing to happen. It does happen, but the session will start itself back up, or at least we've seen, because I have tried that. I've actually tried failing over between sites intentionally to see how long TLS took, and to me, it was imperceptible. Maybe it took a half a second or so for the session to fail.
That's great. That's the information I was looking for. It's like, yeah, it happens, and it's not worth
it's not worth worrying about. From what we see, the vast majority of endpoints are very consistently connecting to our Anycast nodes. We have actually some instances where we see the same IP address multiple places connecting to different Anycast nodes, and that's because certain networks actually have Anycast caching resolvers in their networks, where we'll see the same IP address in 5 different places around the world, but it'll always be connecting to that particular Anycast node. So I couldn't tell you if the traffic is shifting, but I know I see simultaneous connections from the same IP address so Anycast to Anycast, essentially. It seems to work. And those are actually very high volume destinations, so I would hear it if there was a problem.
Just a question from Sarah. Have you run across any issues specifically with
Have we run into any specific problems with provisioning Anycast DNS over TLS? No. I mean, that's really becomes an operational question of how we deploy the software, I think. I'm not sure if that's the context of the question, sir. But no, we've not run into any issues. We had we did have one minor issue, which was our certificate lifespan started to decrease, and we only waited till 5 days before, I think, expiry before we updated cert. That's kind of an operational question. It took us a while to get cert distribution working. In fact, we had one out of all the instances we missed one, which of course somebody noticed very quickly, because again, it's actually good to have a very technical population to start with. But yeah, out of all of our instances, we missed one because it wasn't in our standard update cycle. So it's forced us a little bit to improve our deployment software because people notice.
To follow on for that, as services like Cloudflare have proven that you can run TCP services over Anycast, there might be issues with just a wide distribution between having a load balance issue for a particular client going to a TCP session.
Well, the question was, is there a problem with Anycast and TCP load balancing? And we really haven't seen it. This again might get to needing better analytics, but of course, regular DNS runs over TCP just as well as TLS does, and we really see fairly stable connections. That's if one endpoint is connecting to one of our POPs, one of our Anycast POPs, they're fairly stable. There's not a lot of fluctuation. We don't see it going from A to B to A to B to A to B. It's A to B, and then it stops. And there's not a lot of, it doesn't go back and forth. We see very little flapping on path choice at the moment. And in fact, once it gets locked to one side, or one POP, it stays there for most of the time. Yes.
Have you had, sorry, my name's Faye. Have you had complicated issues where, I know we spoke earlier about different points of presence and under different government jurisdictions. So where you've got DNS censorship, say in the UK for piratebay.org, if there's an Anycast, if there's a routing issue, there's a hurricane that takes out a bunch of the underground cables and this will end up going to another jurisdiction. How have you guys kind of worked around how you might deal with something that should have been censored at a point of presence in one location by DNS? Going somewhere else where it was actually okay to go?
So that starts to get into a lot of policy questions. So the answer is that, her question was, how do we deal with different, and we'll call them censorship policies by different jurisdictions when routing changes and we have users from one place going to another? So we don't right now. Our policy, which is still in legal review, so I'll put that caveat in, is that a policy of censorship that's applied to one particular resolver, which we really have none of that at the moment, but our guideline is that when we have a censorship policy applied to one of our recursors, it is only applicable to the recursor that is within the jurisdiction that is defined. So if an end user in England ends up talking to something in the United States, they are therefore underneath the policy of the framework of the United States as far as the censorship list. That's correct. That's correct. So it's impossible for us also to determine the origin of a user. We can make a best guess based on some industry standard IP address to geolocation information, which is universally terrible. But it's an extremely difficult question to answer. All we can say with high certainty is that in this POP is located in this nation. Therefore, some of the users connecting to it may be under a jurisdictional control of both the country of where the location of the POP is, as well as where we believe they are emanating. This gets really difficult when we are located mostly at inter-exchange points, IXs. And so we see traffic from all over the place, many nations occurring in a single location. So it's a sticky question, but the answer is we try to not censor as much as possible. We are going to resist that where it is possible, but if it does occur, we are going to look at both the origin of the IP address and the destination, and if both of those are in the jurisdiction in question, then we will block according to whatever the legislative requirements are.
Okay, I think we should change now. Thank you so much. I'm saying because you're in this panel. So Vicki Risk is going to come up and moderate a panel, and we also have Wes and myself. And I wanted to say during lunch, you could go to dnsprivacy.org, and there's very good instructions for installing Stubby, and then you could start using Quad 9 for your DNS queries right away. So you might want to consider that. Sarah's going to talk just briefly about Stubby after lunch during our usable security, but it's pretty easy to establish yourself on this whole regime during a lunch break.
Okay, I just wanted to get the chat window up in case people have questions from chat so we can find them.
You want to use this as well as being there.
Is this the working mic or that one?
Apparently we need to use both mics, is that right? No?
I don't think this mic does anything, does it?
Just the laptop.
It doesn't, but I just didn't want to.
Okay, all right.
It's a psychological prop.
Well done.
Okay.
Okay, I have a couple of canned questions. Do we need to do introductions first, or can we skip that?
Wes and I should say our names, I guess, right?
Okay, why don't you guys introduce yourselves?
Oh yeah, that's true. All right. Well, and you've heard from me. I'm Allison Makin. I work for Salesforce. I'm one of the organizers of this and one of the authors of the DNS Over TLS spec, along with other people in this room and out of this room.
And as a reminder, I'm Wes Hardiker from USC ISI.
Okay.
Okay, so one of the first questions is, what do users need in order to be able to trust recursives? What do they need in terms of a set of criteria to look for? And are there any services available on the web, any place where you can go and plug in your resolver address or something and find out whether or not it meets these criteria?
So I'll take a little bit of that because I've been spending a lot of time on it. There isn't a canonical resource right now for trustworthiness of an organization. There are some distributed trustworthiness audits you can try to go under, and we are attempting to get a number of those, but there is no one source right now. Actually, that was going to be one of my questions for Daniel. I mean, one of the things that I'd like to see is a centralized organization that puts a stamp of approval on things. There's the GDPR certification, which is of course still pending, and we're actually trying to get GDPR certified, but that only gives you so much, right? It simply says you've met the European Union standard of privacy, but that misses a lot of the things that that in Daniel's list that actually are quite relevant. And we would really like for there to be an organization that does that type of audit and trustworthiness validation. But right now, it's basically trying to get people to agree that, hey, yeah, what you've said is a good thing, and we've looked at your methods, and we think that you adhere to some reasonable guidelines. I would like to see a more formal guideline that is specific to DNS or specific to internet services, I suppose, in general, and less defocused like the GDPR is, which is a much broader definition.
Anybody else have anything to add? Or?
Well, I would add that DNSprivacy.org has a list of servers with their stated privacy commitments, and that is at least a good source for people. Well, there's not the verification that John mentioned, but I think that's a good thing. And I think also pretty soon although authentication is a little bit of a different story, being able to use your choice of authentication method to identify that you're speaking to the server you intend to will be helpful. And that spec is coming out. That's a spec that Sarah and DKG led. That should appear momentarily as soon as it gets through Auth 48. And that will give people some other tools, and they'll be implemented in our existing clients.
But those speak to trust, right? But not trustworthiness?
No, they speak to just trust. Like, I have identified I'd like to use Quad 9. How am I actually sure that that's one of the Quad 9 servers?
I think one of the largest problems is that 99.999% of the users have no clue that this is even a concern, right? I mean, we have all the experts in this room, and the reality is that especially with the age of mobility where people are jumping around all the time, they're probably using bad resolvers, or, you know, when's the last time that you could find on T-Mobile, AT&T, and Orange and Verizon what their DNS privacy policy was, or, you know, would a user even care, right? There isn't any, and I think the biggest, you know, impediment is going to be, it's still a publicity problem, right? People just don't care at this point. Until we can start holding the companies accountable, we're not going to make major inroads.
So that actually brings me to my next question, which is, what can we do to make more users outside of this room in this small community care about this?
Wait until the first major breach. I mean, that someone cares about. That tends to bring people's focus when something bad happens, and that's the worst way to say it, but that's the way it goes, right? People don't understand that their DNS data is incredibly sensitive information. They don't even know what it is in most cases. So it may be on the back burner of most people's minds until some bad thing happens. And at the same time, you know, maybe there's a lot of conviction that needs to happen of the people who run DHCP servers, which is kind of our strategy. ISPs and enterprises, you know, those people actually have a better understanding of it, and really enterprise is the best place to go, because you can say, well, your corporate data is exposed, and that gets people's attention, you know, because now there's a legal requirement to have data be protected by some industry standard, right? So enterprise is an easy first win because they already care. Individuals, that's tougher. Education is also an easy win to convince about DNS security, because they have a higher standard to be held to. Individuals are much more difficult group to convince.
Right, we had that good presentation from Philip Winter earlier about the sort of usability and awareness of the people who are knowledgeable enough to choose to use Tor. So we know that there are a lot of obstacles. I mean, I think one of the things we have never done, and it's why we're having the joint session, is do some user interrogation, not in a mean way, to find out what users who are not part of our community actually perceive about the DNS, and how they might be inclined to choose to use a UI or choose to use DNS over TLS on their mobile, as is going to also be presented by Ben later today. So part of it is about, we don't actually know that much about end users, because they're all users, but we've not asked them these questions. We certainly could.
So one thing that you've raised, actually, John, is that possibly the GDPR and the coming implementation of GDPR is an opportunity. You mentioned that there's a GDPR certification. Also, it's very big in the news. certainly enterprises or, you know, everyone in Europe at least is concerned about conforming to it. What can we do to maybe leverage GDPR as an event to get people interested in this? Any thoughts about that?
So I'm actually quite interested as to how some of the other DNS recursive resolvers, especially those that are in multiple nations that are within the EU boundaries, how they are addressing GDPR with what they're doing with data. You know, things like the anonymization we talked about, or that Barrett talked about earlier. If any of that is how is that scrutinized by GDPR, and you know, is reversible anonymization an issue? We've solved the issue by not keeping user data at all. We are kind of in an odd position where we don't actually need it, right? We don't monetize based on that, but there are organizations that do. And so, you know, again, is this going to hurt some of those companies that do other types of DNS? Meaning, are they going to get the negative side of GDPR, and is that going to make a news event? And does that raise people's awareness? I don't know. I can't tell you what after the GDPR is in place. I can't actually tell you what's going to happen. It's a pretty chaotic.
So I have a comment on that too. Yeah. So I actually feel that that many people who work in the tech may not have a picture of what GDPR, its limitations, right? It has a lot of limitations, and especially kind of orients itself to consent and proving you have consent and things like that. So it's possible that we have some missing pieces in DNS. For example, in GeoPriv, which was a working group that I helped to found, we created bits that would be, say, what the user's requirement was for their data, which allowed the user to say, okay, I don't care if you use my data in some way or not. And we don't have that yet, but we could perhaps have something of that nature as an extension in DNS. We might be better off if it doesn't come down on us suddenly that GDPR is at odds with DNS data use, as opposed to us sort of planning a somewhat longer strategy around it. And I wanted to make a little plug. I work for the company Salesforce, and we actually have a 3-unit training on GDPR that I thought was really good, and that is freely available at trailhead.salesforce.com, just if you wanted to go and do like a training that quizzes you about whether you understood what the requirements are. And that's being used by our very large enterprise to kind of get everybody to understand what the requirements are as an enterprise. And to my mind, it allows us some time to make some plans and prepare ourselves for being good at GDPR without actually necessarily being tightly regulated by it before we're ready for that.
I think it's not bad. I actually have a timer set here.
Okay, perfect.
We've still got another 12 minutes.
Okay.
I think you also mentioned that there was some work in one of the RIPE working groups on a BCP. Maybe you could talk about that.
This is, if only Sarah could speak. So Sarah has proposed to a number of people to write a potential best common practices for recursive operators. I think you're in that list. That would be possibly an IETF best common practice or an IETF informational, and then the RIPE community creates operational best practices that are very practitioner focused. So that is sort of part of the, I don't know if you can speak. Can you, Sarah?
Can you hear me?
No.
She can speak, but we can't hear her.
She can speak, but we can't hear her. We're gonna have to fix
Sorry
this before
about that.
the end of before 1 o'clock, 1:30, because she's speaking next.
Maybe.
Maybe.
We're trying. We're waving.
Okay, but so watch for action on that. Send mail to Sarah, who is adequately represented on this in the privacy workshop info about if you're interested and want to contribute. And I think we're going to try to see if Deprive, the working group at IETF, will take up some of this work once some drafts are underway as well.
The people who are in the Zoom conference can hear Sarah, so
okay.
They're enjoying the benefit of her comments, even though
how
we're
cool.
not.
Right, okay.
I just have one comment about your point about the bits that the client could set. I mean,
Yeah.
we
Well,
still
that means
don't
that we can have a running commentary
that the
here
clients
without
I'm
anybody
aware of to
hearing
even
us.
indicate whether or not they're willing
Yeah,
to
we
have
can do our own.
an ID
That's-
information here. So, you know, it's a long road till clients really are able to indicate what you're allowed to do with their information.
I actually have some comments on that because I was thinking about this panel in the last few days. One of the things that I realized is that DNS is if you think about how we've transitioned a lot of other security mechanisms, say in TLS or other stuff, it's happened automatically. Users haven't had to think about it, right? And that's because in TLS and many other things, there's a much more negotiated protocol. And DNS, it wasn't. It was always, I need this bit of information, you will give it back. And not only that, but you're asking it to multiple places, and the resolvers themselves are having to distribute it to around to multiple authoritative servers. And the complexity of doing, sort of multiple upstream resolvers that you may care about. One, hotels offer 8.8.8. I'm sure they'll do quad 9 soon and things like that too. And then they have to go out and talk to all these different places. You only get full coverage of security if all of those channels are actually, being secured, and you trust the things in the middle. And I'm going to talk later today about, how much you trust the upper echelons of stuff. But DNS has no version negotiation like most other protocols. It has no algorithm type negotiation. EDNS 0 has been sort of the incremental step forward with that, but we really haven't pushed that boundary toward, I need these other services. I need to know if you support DTL or if you support DNS over TLS. I need to know what other protection mechanisms you have. And DNS is really missing that today. And we're seeing that result in all sorts of things, including the KSK role for the root, right? There's no way to do a negotiation for, I trust, one of your 2 keys at the moment, or I know the other. We're fighting that battle right now.
It's not a big feedback loop.
Yeah, and the end result of that, last conclusion, the end result of that is the same publicity that's required for anything we do. That really comes from this lack of negotiation, right? HTTPS, we don't go around and talk to people, oh, you need to upgrade this plugin for this browser in order to get the most security. It just happens for them. And we're really missing that in this world.
You sort of do, like when you decommission TLS 1.0 and you have to tell everybody years ahead of time and stuff like that. But there's also the session, there's the DNS session specification, which Sarah and I are co-authoring along with people from the MDNS world. And that may offer that opportunity. And that's a working group last call on DNS op right now. So that might actually be an opportunity to add some more of this now that we're kind of allowing DNS to be a TCP and stateful protocol a little bit more than we have been.
It seems that a lot of the things with DNS could be done opportunistically to some degree because there's such a long state session, unlike a web request where you've got a lot of smaller things. When we're looking at DNS over TLS as an example, I would see that, and I could be naive in my assumption, but that could be an opportunistic request, right? Try it over TLS. Maybe your first request goes over TLS. If that fails, then you fail the UDP, and you keep that socket open. And the client then, the client software stack marks that as a TLS-capable recursive resolver. And the same with any of these other bits, like try it and see what you get. But that then requires on a lot of sophistication on the part of the client library author.
And even more on the resolver, right? If the resolver has to memorize what authoritative servers are out there. And there's been talk of, can we put an DNS 0 extension between the resolver and authoritators to indicate security and things like that.
But
there's work to be done.
It's a small group of people that have to do that code, right? The resolver side is like, there's 6. And they're competing neck and neck with who's got the coolest features, which is really great from my perspective because I'm implementing a lot of them. But
DKG was talking earlier about really wanting to do pre-pushing of signed DNS data that you could trust. There's actually work in the DNSSEC working group, multiple proposals to do that already, and I'm author of one where you turn on an extra bit saying, I don't know what else I need yet. Give me everything, just sign it, right? Just make sure it's signed, and then I'll believe it. So that sort of optimization is at the lower level. But again, I think we're only beginning to see a lot of the negotiations that we can put at DNS that are missing until DNS 0.
So does anybody have any questions or anybody else want to offer any observations about obstacles to deployment?
Or special ways that you think we could get good deployment? You have good ideas.
Incentives.
Yeah, incentives, right? We can also let people go out on the beach for a few minutes.
It's possible, yeah, people
We're
want to go to
looking
lunch.
out at
We're
this
the last
beautiful-
thing before lunch.
Yeah.
so.
Yeah. So why doesn't everybody go out on the beach? But thank you, Vicki, who didn't say it's from ISC, for moderating us, and thank you for being here.
Thanks to the panel.
Come to the other room. What is the room called that we're going to? Toucan, right?
Right next door.
The room right next door after lunch, and then we'll all troop back here after that session.
So we'll probably have to drop this Zoom session and move, but.
We'll let other people deal with that.
Okay.
Because hopefully we'll get our remote speakers back. Okay. Okay.